Well, hi, folks. I'm Michael Tomasky. I'm the editor of the New Republic, and this is the new episode of Tomaskycast, a production of TNR Video. And my guest today is Mr. Ken Martin. Ken is the chairman of the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party, not the Democratic Party, the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. Maybe we'll get him to explain the history of that. But there's a lot more news out of Minnesota to talk about, too, and we'll get to all that. Ken Martin, hi.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Michael. Great to be.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. So we had a piece at TNR.com about what people are calling this Minnesota miracle by our Grace Seegers that posted on July 5th. And uh, I just thought it'd be nice to follow that up with an interview like this, give people a chance to meet the chairman of the party, one of the most successful state Democratic parties, or one of the most successful states for Democrats in the whole country this year. So basically, what happened, Ken, is the Democrats took control of the state Senate, had control of the lower body, and have the governorship in the form of Tim Walz, and pulled off in this legislative session what everybody's calling the Minnesota miracle. So tell people what happened.
Well, look, I mean, first off, it's a throwback to the first Minnesota miracle, which was really in the 1970s, early 70s, when Wendy Anderson and then Democratic held majorities in the legislature pushed forward a whole raft of progressive legislation back then that really led the nation in really laying down a marker for how you actually build community and build your state. And Wendy Anderson was the governor at the time, held a northern pike on the cover of Time magazine, and the title, the byline was "The Good Life," and how Minnesota is building a state that works for all. You flash forward almost a little over 50 years to what happened this last legislative session, and now called the Minnesota Miracle Part 2. Really, this was a much more expansive legislative agenda than we even saw 50 years ago. And I'll tell you what drove that. Of course, the party has some role in this, and that's really limited to just electing people to office. But I'm sure, Michael, you would agree with me that oftentimes people get elected to office and then forget why they ran in the first place, and they don't end up using the power that they had to do anything good. And so
we've
what we
seen that
saw,
happen, yeah.
yeah, it does happen. And we saw this legislative session, frankly, a real eagerness amongst Democrats, DFLers, as we call them here in Minnesota, from our governor to our two legislative leaders and rank and file legislators to not only be aligned in terms of our outcome and goals, but to really use the power we have when we have it to make the biggest difference we can. Because at the end of the day, Minnesota, over the last decade, was one of just a few states that had a divided legislature. And as a result, we had gridlock. Nothing good was happening for the people in this state. And folks understood that power is fleeting. We don't know when we'll have it again. So we should use it when we have it to make the biggest difference we can.
I want to get to the substance of these remarkable legislative accomplishments in a second. But first, I want to ask a political question. Your margin in the state Senate was 1 seat. So you had no Minnesota equivalents of Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, causing trouble and not wanting to go along with things?
Well, I would say, look, while our leaders were aligned in terms of outcomes, that doesn't mean there weren't differences of opinion on how to get there. And that's true within each of the various caucuses. We had a slim majority in the House as well. And
what was that margin?
It's just a 4-seat majority, a 3-seat majority in the House, and so both relatively slim majorities. And the point here is that it took tremendous leadership amongst our caucus leaders to keep their caucus together, to have them working towards a common goal, and giving everyone a chance to have a say and have their voices heard. And that, to me, just from the machinery and the sausage making aspect of what happens in state legislative bodies, was quite miraculous, because you did have a 1-seat majority in the state Senate where just one senator deflecting on any vote, I should say, could have cost us a lot of progress. And so it did take a lot of energy and frankly leadership on the part of our elected officials to keep everyone aligned. And part of the story that people aren't talking about is our Senate leader early in the session found out that she had ovarian cancer, and she was bedridden at the hospital for most of the session, negotiating out these deals from her hospital bed. And so, it's quite miraculous in so many ways, to be honest with you. But yeah, and the result is truly in the pudding, and what we did for people will have an impact for generations to come.
Yeah. What's her name? We should know her name.
Carrie Dietzick,
Mhm.
Senator Carrie Dietzick, our Senate
Yeah.
Majority Leader.
Wow, that's really something. How's she doing?
Well, she's still battling it, and just went through her last round of chemo last week, and we're all hoping and praying. It's a pretty serious form of cancer, but it's she's optimistic, and she's going to fight it just like she's fought her whole political career. So we're certainly hopeful.
Well, best wishes to her. So let's talk about the accomplishments. Why don't you just tick them off in the order that they come to you? And
well, there's a whole list of them, and the list is long. But let me just start with the fact that really in Minnesota we're sort of the antidote to what we're seeing in states like Texas and Florida, and states where Republicans are trying to make people's lives harder. We're actually here in Minnesota trying to make people's lives easier. So let me just start with the fact that we passed the largest paid family and medical leave law in our nation's history, 20 weeks of paid leave for working families. No one will ever have to worry again about having to take time off from work to take care of a sick family member. We passed the nation's leading and largest child tax credit, which will help cut childhood poverty in this state by a third, and really help working families. We passed a bill to create free college tuition for low wealth families in this state, making it easier for people to access higher education. We passed a law to make free school meals for all Minnesota children, so no one has to be stigmatized by a different color lunch ticket. We passed $3 billion of tax cuts for working families and low wealth communities. We made the largest investment ever in our education system, our public schools, over $4 billion over the next 4 years. We passed significant gun violence prevention measures. We codified abortion rights. We passed a bill to go carbon-free by 2040. We restored the vote to thousands of felons. We passed a bill to do driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants.
Wow.
We passed a gender-affirming care bill, meaning we're the 5th state in the country to actually become a trans refuge state. We made Juneteenth a state holiday. We banned conversion therapy. We legalized adult use cannabis. We automatic voter registration. There's so many more. I'll tell you, the list is long. $1 billion worth of investment in affordable housing, as an example, right?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that specifically, because that you hadn't mentioned that, and that's. And understand, it's unsexy. Housing is unsexy, but it's a crisis in this country these days. And I'm sure in Minnesota, no less than most other places. So, what was that bill about?
Well, look, I mean, the reality is as you mentioned, we're at a crisis point in states throughout this country where people can't afford to live. And so when we thought about this legislative session and how we're trying to make people's lives easier, what are those pain points, right? From healthcare to education. Housing, of course, is chief amongst them, and people can't afford to live anymore because housing market is out of control. No one can afford to buy a home, and of course, as a result, rental rates are so sky high, people can't even afford to rent. As a result, we're seeing more homeless people. We're seeing more people who are struggling to find affordable housing, having to move further out to communities much further away from their jobs. All of that puts a huge strain on people in our state. As a result, lawmakers did the right thing by investing in $1 billion in affordable housing, which is going to significantly help people, live in the communities where they work and improve their lives.
Yeah. Looking down the rest of the list, some of the things you ticked off. Talk about the tax cuts for middle and working class people. Because a lot of people don't realize, I mean, that's not government spending, but that's a liberal progressive thing, because, when tax cuts for the rich is not a liberal progressive thing, but tax cuts for working and middle class people is a progressive thing. in part because they'll take that tax cut and they'll spend the money, whereas rich people will hoard it and save it.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, there's an economic benefit to not just the people who are receiving the tax cuts, tax credits. All that comes back in the way of additional spending in the economy. As you said, it churns. And we have seen over the years when you provide tax cuts to the ultra wealthy or wealthy corporations, it does really nothing to help improve the economy, to your point.
Yeah.
But probably what drove this most is not just the economic benefit that you mentioned, but clearly also the impact to people's lives, right? At the time people are struggling, when we see inflation across the country and the cost of raising a family, and providing is, I mean, daycare, for God's sake. I mean, my boys are now 20 and 18, and 20 years ago, daycare was I thought expensive, but the amount people have to pay these days just to afford childcare, afford, gas, housing, all the things that, again, and wages by and large, not in this state as much, but by and large have been somewhat stagnant the last 30 to 40 years. People are struggling just to make ends meet. And so the idea of creating tax credits and tax breaks for middle class and low wealth communities, it's not only economically the right thing to do, and morally it's the right thing to do to help give people a break when they need it.
Yeah. Talk to me about the governor, Tim Walz. Was he must have been a key architect of all this, I guess. And talk to me about his political standing in the state right now.
Well, look, he was elected by a pretty large margin in this last election to his second term as governor.
Yeah.
We've now held, by the way, I came in as chair in 2010, and we've now held the governor's office for 2 terms under Mark Dayton, a Democrat, and now will be 2 terms under Tim Walz. That's unprecedented in Minnesota.
I was going to say, when's the last time that happened?
It's never happened for our party, and I'm really proud of our record. We haven't lost a statewide race since I've been chair, and we're creating longevity in these positions. 2 trifectas, like I said, and the result of all that is, of course, is good public policy and legislation that's passing to make a difference in people's lives. But as it relates to Tim Walz, look, I mean, Governor Walz came in. Teacher from southern Minnesota, from a small rural community, a football coach. He in 2004, when I was running John Kerry's campaign, he decided to get involved because he was so mad that his kids got kicked out of a rally with President George Bush. He decided he was going to get involved in politics. I made him the chair of our Veterans for Kerry effort, and 2 years later, in 2006, he ran for Congress. He served in the Minnesota 1st District, only the second Democrat to be elected in that district in over 100 years. And he served there for 12 years. And then, of course, ran for governor in 2018, and not surprisingly won fairly easily because, he's a governor who his slogan was "One Minnesota." It still is. It's not just a slogan. It's how he's governed, which is an eye towards policy that helps not only every part of this state, but also every community and every person. And he's brought that governing model to this newfound trifecta. Remember, the first term he was governor, he did not have a trifecta. And so this is new for him and new for our legislative bodies to have this trifecta and to be able to use it the way he did. It was not surprising to me because he really believes in this idea of making a difference in every community throughout the state. And he's more popular now, frankly, than he's ever been because he's helped so many people in this state.
Yeah, I was going to ask, I will ask right now, how all this has gone down, because, the New Republic loves it, and E.J. Dionne of the Washington Post loves it. Do the people of Minnesota, are they responding, or are these getting good approval ratings?
Oh, just everywhere. And, the 4th of July parades yesterday, as he was going around, I mean, it was almost like he was a rock star. People were just cheering. And, normally at these parades, you get a mixture of cheers and then a few profanities. And we heard none of that over the last few days. But most importantly is if you look at public polling and you look at the response from communities in every part of the state, in the rural parts, the suburban parts, the urban part, he's drawing huge accolades. And I will tell you, because we're Minnesotans, we don't like to toot our own horn too much, and that's part of the reason you don't hear about a lot of this stuff that happens in this state.
Yeah.
We're a pretty reserved and stoic bunch. Where a lot of us are Scandinavians,
Yeah.
and you'll find that with Tim too. The governor, he doesn't really like to toot his own horn that much. Even though I would argue there's no state in the country that's done more this last legislative session than Minnesota has, and I think that's a real testament not only to the governor's leadership but also to Speaker Hortman, our Speaker of the Minnesota House, and then also Senator Dietzick, who the three of them really deserve the lion's share of any credit that comes from this session, because without their leadership, none of this would have happened.
Yeah. I was intrigued by a quote in our piece, in Grace Singers's piece, about this from one of the Republican legislators. I don't think I have it up on my screen. I'll just try to remember it. But he said something like he was complaining about the tax plan. And he said, it wasn't so much that it was a tax increase. They just moved a lot of wealth around from one group of people to another. Well, exactly. That's the point. A lot of wealth, trillions of dollars of wealth have moved in from these people to these people up here in this country over the last 40 years. So you're moving it back to the people from whom it's been taken.
Well,
at least he gets it. He disagrees with it, but at least he gets it.
Yeah, look, Minnesota is a high tax state. We're also a high service state. We have some of the best education in the world. We have more Fortune 500 companies per capita than any other state. And the reason they come here is because of our educated workforce.
Yeah.
50 years ago, that first Minnesota miracle, it's really known for is the fact that if we were going to be more than a cold flyover state, we had to invest in our people. And that is the zeal of Minnesota, is deep investments, not only in infrastructure, but the human infrastructure, investments in our people. And Governor Walz and our legislative leaders continued that this last legislative session. But I will say this, that, Oliver Wendell Holmes said this. He said, taxes are the price you pay for a civilized society. And there's no doubt about it when you look at Minnesota on almost every quality of life indicator, every health index, Minnesota leads the nation. And there's a reason for it. And it's because, we've had a government that's worked for people and invested in people. And I will just tell you that that's no different now. And so people complain about this. They've always complained about Minnesota being a high tax state, but the reality is you get what you pay for. And I will say this, that what I'm grateful for is an acknowledgement by our DFL leaders that, we've seen record high, profits for corporations and CEOs, and for 30 to 40 years, stagnant wages for working class people. And it's time that the wealthy pay their share. It's time that wealthy corporations pay their share. And, they're direct beneficiaries of the investments that we're making in people, right? And so they have a responsibility too.
Yeah. What's Joe Biden's approval rating in Minnesota these days?
It's been inching up quite a bit over the last year, to be honest with you. It's in the high 40s. And I think not unlike Governor Walz and Democratic leaders here, Joe Biden told people what he was going to do when he was on the campaign trail in 2020, and he's delivered on those promises. And I think, there's folks who are going to find reasons to not like Joe Biden, like they do any politician. But on the whole, I think what he'll be judged on is his body of work and what he was able to do those 2.5 years. And there's no doubt that from what he inherited and where this country is at and where it's heading now, he's done a remarkable job. I think he'll be reelected. I can't guarantee you that he'll win throughout the country, but I can guarantee you here in Minnesota, we're going to keep this state blue for President Biden and Vice President Harris.
Yeah, just tell people the recent history very quickly. It was very close in 2016 between Trump and Hillary Clinton, and then less so in 2020. Tell people the numbers.
Yeah, I mean, in 2016, it was 44,000 votes, a point and a half. Hillary just narrowly won this state. And as you know, Michael, Minnesota has the longest streak of any in the nation of voting for the Democratic presidential nominee because of course, in 1984, we voted for our native son, Walter Mondale. We were the only state in the District of Columbia that voted for Mondale. But that's neither here nor there. 16, Hillary narrowly wins by 44,000 votes. This becomes a huge battleground. Trump puts it on his radar screen. He visited multiple times. They made a huge play for it. In 20, they did a similar thing, thinking that they would win. Luckily, we increased the margin to about 7.1%. Joe Biden won Minnesota by 7.1% in 2020, and I would expect that trend to continue. Mainly because not just because of the Democrats and our record, but also the Republicans have really gone off the deep end. They're doubling down on all these extreme positions that continue to be widely unpopular with Americans and certainly with Minnesotans.
Yeah. So the state Republican Party is extreme because even in a state that isn't a state that's not seen as extreme, Minnesota's not Texas. And yet, there are states like the California Republican Party is pretty captured by extremes. Is that the case in Minnesota as well?
Unfortunately, that's now true. And, Minnesota is unique because both parties here, the DFL and it used to be called the Independent Republicans, the IR, for years they were distinct and unique from their national counterparts and somewhat insulated from those national trends. And I think that's still true of the DFL. Unfortunately, the Republican Party here has been captured, much like Republican parties around the nation, by these extreme outliers. And it's unfortunate because you had folks like Dave Durenberger and Harold Stassen and a number of Republicans of note nationally, that Norm Coleman and others who represented this state and didn't hold those type of extreme positions. And Tim Pawlenty, I would say. And, I ran the last campaign against him. The last statewide race we lost was a race I ran against him in 2006. And Tim Pawlenty was not an extreme Republican, right? But those days are long gone now for the Minnesota Republican Party. Every candidate they put up is just like these national wackos that we see right now.
Well, it must be what helped you take the Senate, right?
Well, I will tell you, it certainly doesn't hurt when you have these candidates taking positions that are so far out of the mainstream of where Minnesotans are at. I will tell you, I mean, as an example, they doubled down on, trying to take away a woman's right to choose. This is a state that proudly, codified abortion rights and has it in the Constitution for a reason. It's not something that Minnesotans support.
What did they try to do specifically? What were they?
Well, putting forward, more abortion restrictions and bans, and they've been doing that for some time now. But instead of recognizing and learning the lessons from the 2022 election, Republicans around the nation and frankly even here in Minnesota continue to double down, not only on the attacks on reproductive rights, but also the attack on democracy, right? And as a state, Minnesota, which always leads the nation in voter turnout, people take great pride in civic engagement, right? People do not like the fact that the president egged on an insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. Yet we had Republicans running in this state who are election deniers. We have Republicans running around the country who continue, even to this day, to deny the legitimacy of the 2020 election. They just keep doubling down on extreme positions. And as long as they keep doing that, it is going to make my job a lot easier.
Yeah. So just to reiterate on 2024, you feel that barring some cataclysmic economic thing or something like that, you feel pretty confident about Biden's chances?
Listen, people who know me know that I'm a worrywart, right? My wife says, boy, you're so optimistic in every part of your life except your work. And I said, well, would you rather have me be a pessimist with my work or overly confident? So I will tell you this. I feel as good as I can about 2024, but I will tell you, my old friend and mentor in politics was a guy named Paul Wellstone, who unfortunately many people have forgotten. And Paul used to say, you need to run like you're 20 points behind, even if you're 20 points ahead. And I'll tell you, that's how we approach our work here. We don't believe any election is ever won before it's actually won. We're going to work our butts off to win in this state. And, as a vice chair, I'm a vice chair of the Democratic National Committee. I spent a lot of time around this nation helping to build a party. We're going to work our butts off everywhere to make sure President Biden's reelected. And I'm confident he has the right message. And I'm confident here in Minnesota that we will be able to get the job done for Joe Biden.
Since you mentioned him and since you have his poster behind you above your right shoulder there, for younger people who may be watching this who weren't around in the 90s and the early 2000s, tell them who Paul Wellstone was and why he was such an inspiration.
Well, I will tell you, Paul for those of you who know Bernie Sanders, Paul was Bernie before Bernie. Paul
Yeah.
was a real solid progressive champion who stood up for people every single day of his life. He was a professor at Carleton College, ran for the U.S. Senate in 1990, and despite all odds of beating a Republican incumbent, he was able to pull off one of the biggest upsets in that year. And then later just went on to serve 2 terms in the Senate. And then unfortunately in 2002, when he was running for re-election for his 3rd term, about 10 days before the election, his plane crashed and he and his wife and many of my friends lost their lives.
Yeah.
But I will say that Paul, one of his famous slogans that people like to cite here in Minnesota is he used to say that we all do better when we all do better. Paul was an economic populist. He understood that what united a corn farmer in southern Minnesota and an iron miner and the Iron Range and an immigrant in the inner cities was this ideal of the American dream, that if you worked hard, you played by the rules, you should be able to get ahead, but that there were barriers in the way for so many to be able to achieve that American dream. And so he really just fought hard for everyone. He was everyone's champion. And he was, particularly, as he used to say, he represented the little feller, not the Rockefeller. Paul was an economic populist and a true liberal in the classic sense. And I was very honored to be able to spend time with him and to learn from him.
Yeah, I'll never forget when that plane went down, and it was obviously a lot more devastating for you than for me, but it was crushing for a lot of people around.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, let's finish on an optimistic note, though. What's up for the next term? Is there more to do?
Well, there's always more to do. There's always more to do, as long as we look. It's great because I mentioned the driver's license for undocumented individuals in our state. For so many advocates, they fought in the trenches for that for over 20 years, right?
Yeah.
And I asked a young woman who had worked on that, and I said the same thing to her. Well, what's next? You got what you've been fighting for 20 years. And she put a big grin on her face and she said, you know what? The fight for justice and equality and dignity never ends. And that is true. It never ends. The fight continues. There's always something. There's always an injustice we have to push back on. There's always a way that we have to use the power we have to equalize things for so many communities in our state and country. And so, I'm proud of what we were able to do. I think it will be a little slower than it was this last legislative session, but I will say there's still a lot to do, and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Ken Martin, the chairman of the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party, coming off just a great year. Not the main thing is not that it's a great year for Democrats. The main year is that they accomplished so much for the people of Minnesota, and I think it serves as a real model for what we hope might happen someday here in Washington, D.C., where I live.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me, Michael. I really appreciate it. I'll just leave you with one other thing that Paul said. He used to say that politics is not about what happens in the halls of Congress or in back rooms or big money or special interests. Politics is squarely about the improvement of people's lives. And I think if we did a little bit of that this legislative session, we improved people's lives, then we made a difference. And we all can aspire to that work, which is, what is our legacy, each of us on this planet? Did we make a difference? Did we improve people's lives? Did we strengthen communities? And I think we've done that here in Minnesota. So thanks for having me, Michael.
Thanks for joining me, and continued success.
Thank you so much.